Growing up, I was always the self-sufficient one. I worked hard, earned scholarships, and took on part-time jobs to pay my way through college. I wasn't particularly gifted academically. I was an average student who had to push myself to get decent grades. Meanwhile, my older brother, who was 4 years ahead of me, was the golden child. He wasn't talented in any way, but that didn't matter. Our parents put him on a pedestal, blindly supporting him while ignoring me. While I spent my time studying and trying to make something of myself, my brother was out partying with his delinquent friends. He would come home late, reeking of alcohol and smoke, and our parents would pretend not to notice. On multiple occasions, I overheard him bragging about the illegal activities he was involved in, stealing from stores, getting into fights, and even experimenting with drugs. One time, he and his friends were caught vandalizing school property, and instead of facing any real consequences, my parents pulled some strings and covered it up. They always had an excuse for him. He's just going through a phase, or boys will be boys. It didn't matter how reckless he was, they never held him accountable. Meanwhile, I had to follow every rule to the letter, because if I ever stepped out of line, I knew there would be no one to cover for me. When I confronted my parents about their blatant double standards, they dismissed me, saying I was being too judgmental, and that my brother just needed more help. His toxicity wasn't just limited to his own life. He made sure to make mine miserable too. Anytime I had friends over, he made it his personal mission to humiliate me. He would barge into my room uninvited, making snide remarks and calling me pathetic for wasting time with other nerds. Sometimes, he would sit down with us just to mock me in front of them, bringing up embarrassing childhood stories or outright lying to make me look bad. I could see how uncomfortable my friends were, but he didn't care. He thrived on making me feel small. There was one time when I was having a movie night with a couple of close friends. We were finally starting to enjoy ourselves when he stormed in, turned off the TV, and said, "Why are you losers watching this crap? Let's put on something actually good." He then took over the remote, started playing some obnoxiously loud music, and wouldn't leave until my friends made excuses to go home early. I was furious, but my parents? Oh, that's just how he is. He's just teasing, don't take it so seriously. No matter what I did, my parents never seemed to care as much about me as they did about my brother. When I was younger, I was passionate about art and had spent weeks preparing for a school art competition. The night before the submission, my brother spilled juice all over my entry and then laughed, saying it was just an accident. My parents shrugged it off, telling me, "It's not a big deal, you can always enter again next year." But when my brother wanted a new gaming console for Christmas, they went out of their way to get it, even though money was supposedly tight. Another time, I made the school soccer team after practicing for months. I was thrilled, but when I told my parents, they barely acknowledged it. "That's nice," they said, before immediately shifting the conversation to my brother's failing grades and how they needed to get him a tutor. It was always about him, no matter what I did. Even birthdays weren't fair. For my 16th birthday, my parents got me a cake from the grocery store and told me they hoped I had a nice day. When my brother turned 16, they threw him a huge party, invited all his friends, and even bought him a brand new car. When I asked why he got so much more, they simply said, "It's different for him. He needs more support." My brother was relentless in making my life miserable. One of the worst instances was when I was in high school and spent weeks working on an essay that I was incredibly proud of. I had typed it up on the family computer and left it there, ready to print the next morning. When I logged in, it was gone. My brother had deleted it. He later mocked me, laughing and calling me a nerd and a geek for actually caring about school. I had to rewrite the entire thing from scratch in one night, barely making the deadline. Our parents? They brushed it off, saying, "It's just a joke, don't be so sensitive." Then there was the time he sabotaged my job interview. I had just turned 16 and was excited about getting my first part-time job. The night before my interview, I laid out my clothes and went over my notes. My brother thought it would be funny to help by spilling soda all over my only decent dress shirt and hiding my bus pass. I had to show up in wrinkled, barely passable clothes and was so stressed that I bombed the interview. Again, my parents laughed it off, saying, "It's just sibling teasing." Another time, when I finally saved up enough to buy my own laptop for school, my brother decided he was entitled to it. He took it without asking, used it carelessly, and even cracked the screen. When I got upset, he told me, "Chill, you're lucky I even touch your stuff." I went to our parents, hoping for some kind of support, but they told me, "You can always fix it later, don't be so selfish." My parents' favoritism extended far beyond just dismissing my struggles. When it came time for college, I applied to dozens of universities and managed to secure scholarships that covered a decent portion of my tuition, but not everything. I knew I would have to work part-time to make ends meet. When moving day arrived, my parents didn't even bother to show up to help me settle in. Instead, my aunt, who had always been my source of support, helped me move. She had been the only one who ever acknowledged my struggles, and I confided in her often about my brother's bullying and my parents' neglect. She tried talking to them multiple times, but they always dismissed her concerns. College was tough, but I threw myself into my studies. I worked multiple part-time jobs, often pulling double shifts while still managing my coursework. I spent hours in the library, not just for studying but because I dreaded coming home for the holidays and facing my brother's torment. Whenever I had an opportunity, I would visit my aunt's house instead of going home. She became my safe haven, always reminding me how proud she was of my efforts. Even within our extended family, my brother remained the golden child. Relatives constantly praised him and overlooked my hard work. At family gatherings, I was belittled and compared to him. No matter what I achieved, it was never enough for them. It was clear, I had to fight for everything I had, while my brother had everything handed to him on a silver platter. College was a whirlwind of exhaustion and determination for me. Between attending classes, working multiple part-time jobs, and spending countless hours in the library, I barely had time to breathe. I worked as a barista in the mornings, tutored in the afternoons, and even picked up weekend shifts at a local retail store to make ends meet. Budgeting became a second language. Every dollar was accounted for, and luxuries like eating out or buying new clothes were out of the question. I often survived on instant noodles and cafeteria leftovers, but I refused to let my circumstances break me. The library became my sanctuary, a place where I could focus on my studies and block out the chaos of my life. Despite the overwhelming workload, I managed to maintain good grades, driven by the knowledge that my future depended on my efforts alone. Meanwhile, my brother's streaming career was far from the success he, and our parents, had envisioned. He spent hours every day playing games and shouting into his expensive microphone, but his viewer count rarely climbed above double digits. His attempts to go viral with outrageous stunts or edgy humor fell flat, and his channel became a graveyard of half-finished projects and cringe-worthy content. My parents, still blind to his lack of initiative, continued to fund his dream, buying him new equipment and covering his bills while he lounged at home. They even tried to guilt me into promoting his channel to my friends, claiming it would help him get a real start. I refused, knowing full well that his lack of effort and entitlement were the real obstacles to his success. The contrast between our lives couldn't have been starker. While I was grinding to build a future, my brother was coasting on our parents' generosity, his dreams of internet fame slipping further out of reach. Yet, despite the unfairness of it all, I found solace in my independence. Every late night at the library, every paycheck I earned, and every small victory reminded me that I was building something real, something no one could take away from me. As the semesters rolled by, the weight of my responsibilities grew heavier. There were nights when I barely slept, juggling assignments with work shifts, and mornings when I dragged myself out of bed, fueled by sheer willpower and caffeine. My social life was practically non-existent. While my peers went out to parties or relaxed on weekends, I was either working or catching up on studies. Yet, despite the exhaustion, I felt a quiet pride in knowing I was doing it all on my own. My brother, on the other hand, seemed to be stuck in a cycle of excuses and entitlement. When his streaming career failed to take off, he blamed the algorithm or claimed he just needed one big break. Our parents, ever eager to enable him, suggested he try collaborating with other streamers or posting on different platforms. But he lacked the discipline to follow through, often abandoning projects halfway or lashing out at viewers who offered constructive criticism. His room became a cluttered mess of expensive gear and empty energy drink cans, a physical representation of his wasted potential. The few times I visited home, the tension was palpable. My brother would make snide remarks about my boring life, while our parents subtly pressured me to help him out or give him advice. I bit my tongue, knowing anything I said would fall on deaf ears. Instead, I focused on my goals, determined to prove that hard work and perseverance could overcome even the most uneven playing field. By the end of my second year, I landed a paid internship in my field of study, a small but significant step toward the future I was building. Meanwhile, my brother's streaming setup gathered dust as he floated to his next big idea, leaving me to wonder how long our parents would keep funding his delusions. By the time I reached my third year of university, I was finally starting to see the fruits of my relentless hard work. My grades were solid, and I had managed to secure a paid internship at a reputable company in my field. The internship was demanding, but it was also incredibly rewarding. I was learning so much, building a network of professionals, and gaining hands-on experience that would set me apart after graduation. It wasn't easy juggling the internship with my part-time jobs and coursework, but I was determined to make the most of every opportunity. I often stayed late at the office, soaking up as much knowledge as I could, and then headed straight to the library to finish assignments. It was exhausting, but I knew it was worth it. For the first time, I felt like I was truly building a future for myself, one that was entirely my own. Meanwhile, my brother's life was a stark contrast. While I was grinding day and night, he was out partying until the early hours, drinking and living recklessly. He'd stumble home at 3 a.m., reeking of alcohol, and sleep until noon. His streaming career had all but fizzled out, but he still clung to the idea that he was destined for fame. He'd occasionally post a half-hearted video or stream, but his heart wasn't in it. Instead, he spent most of his time hanging out with his delinquent friends, wasting money on nights out and expensive gadgets that our parents happily funded. It was infuriating to watch him live so carelessly while I struggled to make ends meet, but I tried to focus on my own path. What hurt the most, though, was our parents' complete lack of support for me. Not once did they ask how my internship was going or if I needed help with anything. They never checked in to see how I was managing my workload or if I was doing okay financially. It was as if my successes were invisible to them. Meanwhile, they continued to baby my brother, making excuses for his behavior and throwing money at his latest projects. When he crashed his car after a night of drinking, they paid for the repairs without a second thought. When he complained about being stressed from his non-existent streaming career, they bought him a new gaming chair to help him focus. It was maddening. I remember one particular phone call with my mom during my internship. I had just finished a big project and was feeling proud of myself, so I decided to share the news with her. Her response was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear," she said, before immediately changing the subject to my brother. "Your brother's been feeling really down lately. He's thinking about starting a podcast, but he needs some new equipment. Maybe you could give him some advice?" I was stunned. Here I was, working my tail off to build a future, and all she could talk about was my brother's latest pipe dream. It was a harsh reminder of where I stood in their eyes. Despite their lack of support, I kept pushing forward. My internship turned into a part-time job offer, and I was able to save a little money for the first time. I even started making friends at work and school. People who appreciated me for who I was and didn't make me feel like an afterthought. It was a refreshing change from the toxic dynamic at home. By the time graduation rolled around, I felt a mix of pride and bitterness. I had done it. I had earned my degree, gained valuable work experience, and built a life for myself, all without a single ounce of support from my parents. Meanwhile, my brother was still living at home, jobless and directionless, with our parents still coddling him like a child. It was a bittersweet victory, but it was mine. I had proven that I didn't need their approval or help to succeed. And as I walked across that stage to accept my diploma, I knew that my future was finally in my hands, and no one could take that away from me. By the time I hit my mid-20s, my career was exploding in ways I could have only dreamed of during those sleepless nights in college. The company I had interned with offered me a full-time position after graduation, and I quickly climbed the ranks. My hard work paid off, literally. I landed a six-figure salary, a milestone that felt surreal after years of scraping by on instant noodles and part-time paychecks. I moved into a nice apartment, bought myself a reliable car, and even started saving for the future. For the first time in my life, I felt secure. I had built something from nothing, and it was all mine. Around the same time, I stumbled into a cliché romance that felt like something out of a movie. I was at a coffee shop, buried in my laptop, trying to finish up some work, when I accidentally knocked over my latte. It spilled all over the table, and before I could even react, the woman sitting next to me handed me a stack of napkins with a smile. We started talking, and one conversation turned into many. Her name was Emma, and she was everything I didn't know I needed: kind, funny, and fiercely independent. She had her own career, her own passions, and her own drive, which made me admire her even more. We started dating, and for the first time, I felt like I had someone in my corner who truly saw me for who I was. It was a refreshing change from the dynamic I had grown up with. While my life was finally falling into place, my brother's was spiraling further out of control. I didn't hear much from him directly. Our relationship had been strained for years, but I started getting updates from friends and even friends of friends. Apparently, he had developed a reputation for sleeping around. He would hit on every woman he met, from bars to social gatherings, and it didn't matter if they were single, taken, or even friends of friends. He had no shame, no boundaries, and no regard for anyone's feelings. It was like he was trying to fill some void with meaningless encounters, but it only made him look more desperate and shallow. I heard stories about him showing up at parties uninvited, making inappropriate comments, and even getting into arguments with other guys over women he had no business pursuing. It was embarrassing, to say the least. My parents, of course, turned a blind eye to it all. They still saw him as their golden child, their charismatic son who just needed to find himself. Meanwhile, I was building a stable, fulfilling life, but they never seemed to notice or care. The contrast between us couldn't have been more glaring. I was in a committed relationship, thriving in my career, and finally feeling like I had control over my life. My brother, on the other hand, was still living at home, jobless, and relying on our parents to fund his reckless lifestyle. He had no direction, no ambition, and no sense of responsibility. It was sad, in a way, but I had long since stopped feeling sorry for him. He had made his choices, and I had made mine. As I sat in my apartment one evening, sipping coffee with Emma and talking about our future, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come. I had built a life I was proud of, one that was entirely my own. And while my parents' favoritism and my brother's toxicity had shaped me in ways I couldn't forget, they no longer defined me. I had broken free from their shadow, and for the first time, I felt truly at peace. A few years into my successful career and stable relationship with Emma, I received a text from my parents that stopped me in my tracks. It was unexpected, to say the least. They wanted to repair our bond, and asked if we could meet up soon to talk. They mentioned needing my help, financially and otherwise, and said it was important. My first reaction was a mix of disbelief and frustration. After years of being ignored, dismissed, and overlooked, they were finally reaching out, but only because they needed something from me. It felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called Emma and vented about the situation. She listened patiently, as she always did, and reminded me that I didn't owe them anything. "You've built your life without them," she said. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's on your terms." Her words gave me the clarity I needed. I decided to meet with them, but only to hear them out. I wasn't going to let them guilt me into anything. When we finally met at a quiet cafe, the tension was palpable. My parents looked older, more worn down than I remembered. They started by awkwardly complimenting my career and asking about Emma, but it didn't take long for them to get to the point. They admitted they were in financial trouble and needed my help. As they explained, I felt my jaw tighten. It turned out they had poured almost everything they had into my brother's latest venture, an Instagram influencer lifestyle. He had convinced them that he was on the verge of becoming the next big thing, throwing massive parties, renting luxury cars, and posting lavish photos to build his brand. But it was all a facade. In reality, he was drowning in debt. He owed money to vendors, venues, and even some shady characters he'd borrowed from to keep up the illusion. My parents, desperate to save him, had drained their retirement savings to bail him out. Now, they were struggling to make ends meet and facing the harsh reality of their choices. As they spoke, I felt a mix of anger and pity. Anger because they had enabled my brother for years, ignoring every red flag and dismissing every warning. Pity because they were now paying the price for their blind favoritism. They asked if I could help them financially, saying they needed to cover their mortgage and basic living expenses. They also hinted that my brother might need a place to stay temporarily, as he was going through a rough patch. I took a deep breath before responding. I told them that while I sympathized with their situation, I couldn't just hand over money or take responsibility for my brother's mistakes. I reminded them of the years I had spent working tirelessly to build my life, often without their support or encouragement. I told them that if they wanted to repair our relationship, it would take more than a single conversation. It would take time, effort, and a genuine acknowledgement of the past. They looked stunned, as if they hadn't expected me to push back. My mom started to cry, and my dad tried to argue that family should always come first. But I stood my ground. I told them I would consider helping them in small, specific ways, like covering a utility bill or helping them create a budget, but only if they were willing to make real changes. I also made it clear that my brother's problems were his own to solve, and I wouldn't be bailing him out. The meeting ended on a tense note, but I left feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I had set boundaries with them, and it felt empowering. I knew they might not understand or accept my decision, but I also knew I had to protect the life I had worked so hard to build. As I drove home, I thought about how far I'd come. I had a career I loved, a partner who supported me, and a future full of possibilities. My parents' favoritism and my brother's recklessness had shaped me, but they no longer controlled me. I had broken the cycle, and for the first time, I felt truly free. Despite my initial willingness to help in small ways, it became clear that my parents hadn't truly changed. They continued to prioritize my brother, making excuses for his behavior and expecting me to pick up the pieces. Every conversation with them eventually circled back to his needs, his struggles, and his latest, big idea. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, and I realized I couldn't keep sacrificing my peace for people who had never truly valued me. After much reflection, I made the difficult decision to cut them out of my life. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I sent them a final message, explaining that I needed to prioritize my own well-being and that I couldn't continue to be part of a dynamic where I was always an afterthought. I wished them well but made it clear that I needed space, permanently. It was a painful decision, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I felt fully in control of my life, free from the weight of their expectations and favoritism. Emma stood by me through it all, reminding me that I deserved to be surrounded by people who truly cared about me. Update 1. Just when I thought my parents couldn't sink any lower, they proved me wrong. A few months after I exposed their lies on social media, they decided to take legal action against me. They filed a lawsuit alleging that I had signed a contract promising to support them financially after I got a job, including sending them a monthly check. According to their claim, I had breached this contract by never sending them a single payment. The audacity of it all was staggering. Not only was the entire claim false, but they had no evidence to back it up. No signed contract, no written agreement, not even a text message or email discussing such an arrangement. It was a blatant attempt to manipulate the legal system and punish me for standing up to them. When I received the lawsuit, I was equal parts furious and baffled. I couldn't believe they would go this far, especially after everything they had already put me through. But I wasn't going to let them win. I immediately hired a lawyer, who assured me that their case had no merit. We filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that their claim was baseless and lacked any evidence. My lawyer also pointed out that even if such a contract existed, which it didn't, it would likely be unenforceable without consideration, meaning they would have had to provide something of value in exchange for my promise to support them, which they never did. The court date arrived, and my parents showed up with their lawyer, looking smug and confident. But their confidence quickly evaporated when the judge started questioning them. They were asked to produce the alleged contract, and when they couldn't, the judge grew visibly skeptical. Their lawyer tried to argue that the contract had been verbal, and that I had morally obligated myself to support them, but the judge wasn't having it. Without any proof of an agreement, their case fell apart. My lawyer then presented evidence of my financial independence, showing that I had paid my own way through college and had never relied on my parents for support. We also submitted the social media posts where my parents had falsely claimed to have given me everything, which directly contradicted their argument in court. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that their lawsuit was nothing more than a desperate attempt to control and punish me. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile the same claim. He also warned my parents about the consequences of filing frivolous lawsuits, suggesting they could be held liable for my legal fees if I chose to pursue it. I decided not to go after them for fees, not out of kindness, but because I wanted to be done with them for good. The lawsuit had already cost them time, money, and whatever shred of credibility they had left. After the case was dismissed, I made a public post detailing what had happened. I shared the court's decision and reiterated that their claims were completely false. The response was overwhelming. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers expressed their support and outrage at my parents' behavior. Meanwhile, my parents and brother went radio silent, likely realizing they had no way to spin this in their favor. The lawsuit was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I had already cut them out of my life, but this confirmed that I had made the right choice. They were willing to lie, manipulate, and even weaponize the legal system to try to control me, and I wanted no part of it. After I cut my parents out of my life, I thought the worst was behind me, but I underestimated how far they would go to manipulate the situation. The extended family, who had always been distant but suddenly had a lot to say, started reaching out to me. They tried to guilt me into reconciling with my parents, spinning a narrative that I was ungrateful, and that my parents had sacrificed so much for me. They claimed my parents had supported me throughout my life, which was a blatant lie. I had worked tirelessly to pay my way through college, secure internships, and build my career, all without their help. It was infuriating to hear them rewrite history, but I refused to engage. Things escalated when my parents and brother took their manipulation to social media. My brother, who had always thrived on drama, started posting false stories about me, painting me as the villain who had abandoned my family in their time of need. He claimed I was selfish, ungrateful, and had turned my back on them despite all they had done for me. My parents joined in, sharing posts about how they had given me everything, and how heartbroken they were by my betrayal. They even started a hashtag #FamilyFirst, to rally sympathy from their friends and followers. It was a full-blown social media campaign designed to paint me as the bad guy. The final straw came when my parents sent a formal complaint to my company, accusing me of being unethical and disloyal, and suggesting I wasn't fit for my role. They hoped it would get me fired or at least damage my reputation at work. But their plan backfired spectacularly. My boss, who had always been supportive and understanding, called me into her office to discuss the complaint. I explained the situation honestly, sharing the years of neglect, favoritism, and manipulation I had endured. She was appalled by their behavior and assured me that the complaint would go nowhere. In fact, she praised me for handling the situation with professionalism and encouraged me to take whatever steps I needed to protect myself. Fed up with their lies and manipulation, I decided it was time to set the record straight. I drafted a detailed social media post, exposing the truth about my parents and brother. I included proof, screenshots of text messages, financial records showing I had paid my own way through college, and even photos of the lavish gifts they had bought my brother while I struggled to make ends meet. I also shared the complaint they had sent to my company, along with my boss's supportive response. I didn't hold back, calling out their favoritism, their lies, and their attempts to sabotage my career. The post went viral almost immediately. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers rallied behind me, expressing their support and outrage at how I had been treated. My parents and brother tried to defend themselves, but their excuses fell flat in the face of the evidence I had provided. The extended family, who had previously sided with them, began to distance themselves, realizing they had been fed a false narrative. My parents' social media campaign crumbled, and the #FamilyFirst was quickly flooded with comments calling out their hypocrisy. Final update: just when I thought my family couldn't sink any lower, they proved me wrong yet again. A few weeks after their failed lawsuit, my brother showed up at my home uninvited. I wasn't there at the time, but Emma was. She answered the door, and before she could even speak, my brother pushed his way inside, shouting and demanding to see me. When Emma tried to stop him, he became physically aggressive, shoving her against the wall and yelling obscenities. Thankfully, Emma managed to call 911 before the situation escalated further, and the police arrived just as my brother was trying to force his way into our bedroom. I rushed home as soon as Emma called me, and by the time I got there, the police had already arrested my brother for trespassing and assault. Emma was shaken but unharmed, and I was furious. This was the final straw. My brother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I immediately filed for a restraining order against him and my parents, citing their history of harassment, manipulation, and now, physical violence. I also pressed charges against my brother for assault and breaking and entering. The court process moved quickly, and the evidence was overwhelming. Emma gave a detailed statement about the incident, and the police report backed up her account. I also submitted documentation of my parents' and brother's previous behavior, including the baseless lawsuit and the social media campaign they had launched against me. The judge didn't hesitate to grant the restraining order, barring my brother and parents from contacting me, coming near my home, or approaching Emma. The order also included a provision that they couldn't discuss me on social media or involve third parties in their harassment. As for my brother, he was charged with assault and trespassing. He tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, and that he just wanted to talk, but the evidence against him was too strong. He was sentenced to 90 days in jail, along with probation and mandatory anger management classes. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was enough to send a clear message: his behavior had consequences. The restraining order and my brother's jail time marked the end of their attempts to control and intimidate me. My parents, who had always enabled him, were finally forced to face the reality of what their favoritism had created. They didn't reach out to apologize or make amends. Instead, they retreated, likely realizing they had no legal or moral ground to stand on. With the restraining order in place and my brother serving his jail sentence, the chaos that had defined my relationship with my family finally came to an end. The silence that followed was both strange and liberating. For the first time in my life, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next manipulation or outburst. Emma and I took the time to heal, leaning on each other and the strong support network of friends and colleagues who had stood by us through everything. I threw myself into my career, continuing to excel at work and taking on new challenges that pushed me to grow. Emma and I also focused on building a life together, one filled with trust, respect, and mutual support. We traveled, explored new hobbies, and even adopted a dog, a goofy golden retriever named Max, who quickly became the center of our little family. It was a simple, joyful life, and it was everything I had ever wanted but never thought I could have. As for my parents and brother, I heard through the grapevine that they had retreated into their own world, still unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. My brother's probation and anger management classes didn't seem to have changed him much, and my parents continued to enable him, though their resources and their patience were running thin. I didn't feel anger or resentment toward them anymore. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of pity. They had chosen to live in a cycle of toxicity, and I had chosen to break free. That was the difference between us. One day, while cleaning out an old box of childhood mementos, I came across a drawing I had made when I was a kid. It was a picture of a house with a smiling family standing in front of it. At the bottom, in my childish handwriting, I had written, "My happy family." I stared at it for a long time, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. The family I had dreamed of as a child didn't exist, but the life I had built for myself was better than anything I could have imagined. I had created my own version of a happy family, one built on love, respect, and mutual support. I folded the drawing and put it back in the box, not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as a testament to how far I had come. I had faced adversity, stood up for myself, and built a life that was truly my own. And as I looked around at the home I shared with Emma and Max, I felt a deep sense of peace. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape.